Greetings, comrades. Greetings, comrades. Have you ever wondered what are you not allowed to do in your country? Usually, a special book called The Criminal Code serves as a checklist of such things. It describes exactly what you cannot do, and what exactly you will face if you do it. But sometimes there are certain unwritten prohibitions that must be adhered to. Rules that are not always clear and obvious to outsiders. Sometimes they are written, but still weird. For example, that it is not allowed to chew gum in Singapore, wear yellow in Malaysia, or feed pigeons in Venice. Today we are going to talk about such non-obvious taboos from the time of the Soviet Union. Some of them were official, some of them were not, but for a peaceful life in a Soviet country, it was better to comply with them all. To begin with, we are going to talk about two types of prohibitions. There were things that simply shouldn't have been done because they were condemned, considered indecent or unworthy of a Soviet man. And then there were things that were expressly forbidden by law and/or party. For example, social parasitism, that is, not having a job, was forbidden by law. Or foreign currency transactions. But wearing vivid makeup or dyeing one's hair in bright colors was not formally forbidden, but it was very actively frowned upon at all levels, from neighbors to bosses at work and party workers. Or listening to rock music by certain American and British rock and punk bands. Technically, it was not forbidden, but it was not possible to bring records into the USSR and sell them, or to play them at parties or on the radio. So let's start with the unspoken restrictions first. So, as I said before, it was not appropriate to be different in the USSR. And this was instilled from school. All citizens of the Soviet country are equal, no one should feel superior to the others, and so everyone goes to school in a school uniform. And there were such teachers who literally chased high school girls with a ruler and measured the length of the skirt. God forbid it was a centimeter shorter than the norm. Girls in schools in general had a hard time. Heels? Banned. Pants instead of skirts? Banned everywhere except gym classes. Extra bright makeup could have been just washed off by force. Hair was required to be braided or in a ponytail. And absolutely no long hair on men. It was considered a sign of poor upbringing. However, as it is often the case, what was actively prohibited in school was considered to be the coolest thing ever, both hair and makeup. It was not customary to express romantic feelings in public either. The maximum that lovers could allow themselves was to hold hands or walk arm in arm. Kissing, hugging and close contact were absolutely off limits. In the case of misconduct, slanted glances and scathing reprimands from everyone around, colleagues, neighbors and schoolmates would be the mandatory punishment. Yet somehow passionate male kisses from the genital sector were considered normal. Another pretty wild story was that in the USSR there were no left-handers. Well, there were. My dad still throws darts with his left hand, which is more accurate. But ever since kindergarten, he and all the other left-handed people were specially retrained, taught to use the right hand as the main hand. At school, this was explained by the fact that Soviet school children used ink until the 1970s. It was difficult to do it with the left hand. In this case, you could smear everything you had just written with your sleeve. Otherwise, having a right-handed country was just more convenient. It had to do with the unification of anything and everything. After all machines, instruments, scissors and even vegetable knives in the USSR were designed for right-handed people. It was believed that it would be hard for a left-handed person to live in a right-handed world. Many people, I think, know about the difficulties that Soviet citizens had with traveling abroad. Well, it was actually an unspoken prohibition, because technically no one forbade it. But you couldn't just buy a plane ticket and fly to some country. You needed a reason to go. Whether or not it was a worthy cause was up to the special party organs. Scientific symposium or international youth conference? You have a chance if you're a good specialist. A vacation trip to the sea? Only if you're one of the best workers and you're lucky. But even then, Bulgaria, at most. Besides, any trip abroad meant dozens of checks and approvals by different bureaucratic institutions. Even if you go to a friendly country of the socialist camp, and if you manage to leave, don't be in a hurry to rejoice. There was a whole set of rules for how a Soviet citizen outside his homeland was to behave. And everything was monitored by special agents who were assigned to each group of citizens leaving the country. If you broke any of the rules, you risked being banned from leaving ever again. What else was not recommended in the USSR? Well, to adhere to any religion. Fortunately, there was little physical persecution of believers, but religious organizations were severely restricted. Ostentatious religiosity was frowned upon, and if someone in your workplace found out that you were a frequent church visitor, it would seriously affect your career advancement potential. Speaking of jobs, in the USSR it was practically impossible to get a college degree and then immediately get the job of your dreams. In 90% of cases, university graduates could not choose where they wanted to work. Job by distribution. The state itself determined where to send graduates after university, and you were obliged to work in the place you were sent to for 3 years minimum. On the one hand, this guaranteed employment, but on the other hand, workers sometimes had to move to the other side of the country. It was possible to avoid this through marriage or other tricks, but most people had to just put up with it. It was a similar situation with the Propiska. You could not simply change your place of residence. The government did not allow people to move freely around the country, and it restricted the flow of villagers into the cities. For example, peasants, according to the state, had to live and work on the territory of collective and state farms, and the outflow of labor from the village was perceived as a threat to agricultural development. Therefore, until 1974, all rural residents of the USSR and certain groups of the population who were considered unreliable did not have passports or propiskas. Sounds wild, but in 1967, 37% of all citizens of the Soviet Union did not have the right to obtain a passport. In fact, to move from city to city, there were actually 3 possibilities: to get married, to exchange apartments with someone, if you had one, or to get an invitation to work from some organization. This is why fictitious marriages were fairly widespread. You pay someone living in Moscow a certain amount, he marries you, and you get the cherished stamp in your passport that you are a full-fledged resident of the capital. Marrying a foreigner? Yeah, that was difficult. In Stalin's time, from 1947 to 1953, there was an outright ban on international marriages and cohabitation, for violation of which one could easily be sent to the labor camps for counter-revolutionary actions. Khrushchev abolished this, but affairs with foreigners remained widely viewed as a betrayal of the Soviet system. In 1969, the Soviet Family Code formally allowed marriages to foreigners, but in practice the authorities thwarted them in every way they could, forcing people to collect a ton of documents and signatures from various authorities. And finally, let's talk about cultural bans. Hollywood films were not officially banned, but not all of them made it into the box office. In particular, no Agent 007, or Rambo, or any film in which America is portrayed in a good light and the USSR in a bad one. As for books, the state banned them officially and quite actively, from Orwell and Wells to Bulgakov, Solzhenitsyn and Nabokov. The funniest thing here is music. Rock culture in the USSR, just like the hippie culture, was considered a rebellious and corrosive influence on young people, so the KGB regularly compiled a list of Western and Soviet musical groups that supposedly had a destructive effect on Soviet youth. For example, here's my favorite list of unrecommended music groups, according to the Mykolaiv Regional Committee, in which Scorpion promotes violence, Tina Turner promotes sex, Julio Iglesias promotes neo-fascism, Iron Maiden promotes religious obscurantism, and something called Danish Mode promotes both violence and punk. But just like with long hair, what young people are told not to do becomes the most desirable thing to them. And now about those prohibitions which were indeed directly prescribed in the criminal code and for violation of which there was a very serious punishment. Here it is worth breaking them down by era. because the bands of the 1920s and the bands of the 1980s are very different. In the early 30s you could not celebrate the New Year. In the 80s you could celebrate the New Year, but you could not buy a vodka to celebrate it. But first things first, let's start with the rather harsh laws of the 1930s when, for example, the famous Free Spikelets law was introduced. To be more precise, the Decree on Protection of Property of State Enterprises, Collective Farms and Cooperatives and Strengthening Public Socialist Property. That is, first they took away all the property from the peasants, and now they introduced a law under which peasants could not even use this very property at their own discretion. The theft of collective farm property, even the very free spikelets that fell out of the sack, could be punishable by execution or 10 years in the camps. In July 1937, the USSR Prosecutor General Vyshinsky prepared a report with very interesting statistics. The USSR Prosecutor's Office checked 115,000 sentences handed down under the law of free spikelets, and in more than 91,000 cases the application of this decree was found to be incorrect and malicious. There were also laws in the 1930s that made it illegal to be late for work or to leave the workplace without a reason. All of this is perfectly described in the Article 12 of Stalin's 1936 Constitution. Labor in the USSR is a duty and a matter of honor for every able-bodied citizen, according to the principle, he who does not work does not eat. In 1938, the Central Committee of the VKPB issued a decree that punished anyone who was more than 5 minutes late for work. The decree stipulated a reprimand and transfer to a lower-paid job for up to 3 months if they were less than 20 minutes late. If a worker was repeatedly tardy or was more than 20 minutes late without a valid reason, he was fired. For example, here is the profile of Vladimir Alexandrovich Koshelev, a machinist at the Tsiglamensky power plant. Koshelev VA, born 1914, candidate member of the VKPB, in December 1940 convicted of being late for work and sentenced to 4 months of forced labor at the place of work with a 20% deduction from wages. His tardiness for work was caused by his attendance at a dinner party, where Comrade Koshelev was presented with the badge of a participant in the fighting at Hassan. Genius! On June 26, 1940, another remarkable decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR on the transition to an 8-hour workday, a 7-day work week, and prohibition for workers and employers to leave enterprises and institutions without permission came out. Now you could not just quit your job at the plant, only with the permission of the plant's director, and yes, there were no days off. During the Great Patriotic War, this situation was controlled even more strictly. Leaving a job at a military factory was equated to desertion, and the workers were tried by military tribunals. However, you can't justify these laws. After all, the country was actively preparing for the World War, and there was no time for leniency. But let's move on to a more peaceful time. Do you think it was possible to not work in the USSR after the war? Well, it wasn't. In the Soviet Union, those who were not officially employed were punished with fines and correctional labor, and then could be sentenced to up to 4 years in prison. In order to fall under the article, you had to live for 4 months on unearned income. In this case, in fact, any creative worker could fall under this article of the Criminal Code. What labor income does a poet or musician have? Officially, the Nobel laureate in literature, Joseph Brodsky, or the legend of Soviet rock music, Viktor Tsoi, for example, were considered to be social parasites. The latter had to take a job as a stoker in a boiler room in order to not be labeled as a slacker. But okay, it was impossible not to work. But how about the article on the prohibition of poverty and vagrancy? Article 209 of the USSR Criminal Code. For systematic vagrancy or begging, imprisonment for up to 2 years or correctional labor from 6 to 12 months. Fortunately, it was rarely used. Usually such comrades were simply taken out to the 101st kilometers, about which I told you earlier. What else was forbidden? Another type of unearned income, namely the resale of anything, or speculation, or possession of foreign currency. Yes, in the land of the Soviets it was forbidden to hold money of any other state, and this was introduced by the Bolsheviks way back in the 1920s. Article 88 of the USSR Criminal Code. The sale or exchange of foreign currency by a private individual was punishable by 3 to 8 years in camps. For repeated speculation, up to 15 years in camps. Later, on Khrushchev's personal instruction, the punishment became even harsher. For especially large transactions, it was possible to receive the death penalty. This is what happened to the famous currency dealer Yan Rokotov. Speculation, that is, buying and reselling goods for profit, was punishable by imprisonment for up to 2 years with or without confiscation of property, or correctional labor for up to 1 year, or a fine of up to 300 rubles. Yes, something that in Western countries was almost the basis of the economy, in the USSR was a criminal offense. Also, moving to another country was considered treason, or more precisely, the refusal to return to the USSR after the trip to the West. 10 to 15 years of labor camps or the death penalty. Article 64 of the Criminal Code of the USSR. What about the ban on certain sports? Yes, in some periods of time in the Soviet Union, bodybuilding and karate were considered illegal. In the fall of 1981 came out the official decree on administrative responsibility for violation of the rules for teaching karate, and the addition to the article on illegal possession of weapons, with a paragraph about illegal teaching of this discipline. Bodybuilding in the USSR was also perceived as a Western influence. The Soviet government believed that there was no need to intentionally pump muscles and admire oneself in front of the mirror, and that the strength and stamina were needed in order to work as hard as possible. Bodybuilding was banned in 1973, and the winner of the first bodybuilding championship, held 2 years earlier, Vladimir Khamulov, was caught in the crossfire. He was imprisoned for promoting bodybuilding, formerly accused of rape. Similar bans at different times also applied to billiards, a bourgeois game not suitable for the Soviet man, and baseball. Baseball is a unique story. It was imported in the 1930s by workers from the United States and was gaining enormous popularity very rapidly, but then it was just as abruptly banned and forgotten for 50 years. So what's next? Homosexuality was considered a crime against the person and was punishable by prison sentences of up to 5 years and up to 8 years for concomitant crimes. This article appeared in the Soviet Criminal Code in the early 30s at the initiative of Genrikh Yagoda, who was then the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs of the USSR. In his report to Stalin, he linked non-traditional sexual orientation with the counter-revolution. Moonshine brewing was periodically forbidden in the 20s and in the 80s, and Gorbachev's dry law is considered by many to be one of the main reasons for the collapse of the USSR. Criticism of the Soviet system, a special article, anti-Sovietism. More precisely, there were several of them in the Criminal Code of 1922. 69. Anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. 70. Propaganda and agitation to aid the international bourgeoisie. 72. Manufacture, preservation and distribution of literature with counter-revolutionary content. 73. Fabrication and distribution of fake rumors or unverified data with counter-revolutionary purposes which may cause panic or distrust and discredit the government. Take your pick, whatever you like more. Finally, the all-encompassing term вредительство, sabotage. Also Article 69, but already in the 1960 code, which could be used to describe any action harmful to the Soviet state, up to 15 years in the labor camps. I have painted a rather gloomy picture, and one might get the impression that in the USSR it was impossible to do anything. Of course, that's not true. To live, to fall in love, to marry, to have children and to work in the Soviet Union was of course possible. But only if one did all this ideologically correctly. Thanks for watching, guys. I apologize for my hoarse voice, still recovering from a cold. And a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Steak221, Steven, Елизавета Zakharova, Kirill Klimuk, Zeman Berze and Jordan Lamotte. See you guys next time.